Hey friends, Bill here. Hope you're having a good week. We're having a good one here as we enter the bowl season here. Lots of gospel preaching at bowl games this year. I think there's guys at about 25 or 30 bowl games. Wonderful opportunity the bowl games are because you have these teams coming in and their fans coming in. We don't ordinarily see these fans, and they're in a new environment. Also gives opportunity for people like Bob Maston and the Bahamas to preach at a game as well. So lots of opportunity here. Then we're going to roll in or will into the new year with Alex, the guys preaching at the College Football Championship in Atlanta, Gasparilla Festival in Tampa, me and Tom Cabral, and then the Super Bowl outreach February 6th to 9. And so today we've got Will Dieterich here to chat with him about how he got into gospel preaching. Will is a Super Bowl outreach team leader this year. Will, how you doing? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You cut out at the very end there.
Okay. How you doing? How's your baby? Tell us, you just had a baby. How's your baby?
Yeah, so I just had a baby boy. We were expecting a girl. It's really a whole crazy story. We didn't know he was a boy for the first hour he was born because we just didn't look. And I was out having a late lunch at 4 p.m. and handling another crazy kid. And so I was out of the room for like an hour. And then I went to go cut the cord. And the midwife was like, basically like, I got to show you something. Or like, she was like, and also this. And then she just like opened up his legs and there it was. He was a boy. So it was a crazy experience.
Were you traumatized at the revelation?
I was really thrown off. I wasn't traumatized, but I was very shocked. It was a very shocking thing to go through. I mean, I've always wanted a son, so it was something I wanted, but we just weren't expecting it. And then we had like all these people from the church sending us boy clothes because we never had a boy before. So we were expecting a third girl, and then ended up having a boy. So it was a real crazy time. Every other time the sonograms they've been read right, and they've said it's a girl, and it was correct. So we didn't even think of the possibility of the sonogram being wrong. But doctors can fail, I guess. So that's what happened.
Well, there you go. So are you getting any sleep? Are they keeping you up? Or are you sleeping and telling them to go to another room?
I'm sleeping. We have him in the bed with us, and my older daughters, or they're not. They're all kids. They're all babies. Penny's 3. Susan's not even 2 yet. She's about to be 2. They're in their own room, sleeping on their bunk bed, and me and Abby have Daniel with us in our room.
Cool. All right, man. Well, tell us the day before, if you remember, before you started preaching, even thought about it, and what happened between that day and the next day when you started thinking about preaching. What happened in your life? What did God do in your life to get you thinking about it?
Well, I don't know if I remember the day before necessarily, the exact day before. I know it was a plan. The plan was to go out to South Lake with Pastor Jeff Rose and Pastor Jeremy Roten when he was still with us on this side of eternity. He's now gone to be with the Lord. Died of cancer when he was 43. A couple years back. I believe it's been a little over 2 years now. But we had a plan. I had a plan to go preach with Jeff and Jeremy for a while, and it just kind of didn't pan out. Like it was going to happen in July, and then it didn't happen, and kind of wanted to at least witness it. And then when I finally got out there, it was like it was the weekend after Thanksgiving. So I know I would have been very fresh in my Bible college days, a freshman. I only had 3 credits of Bible college. You needed 122 to graduate, but I know I was working on school. You don't get breaks for Thanksgiving. So I was working on school, working on like systematic theology classes and stuff like that. And I always had a desire to preach in the open air after getting converted. Maybe not always, but I'd say probably the first year I was a believer, I realized that it was something that I was interested in and wanted to do. And a huge part of that has to do with the fact that I'd been forgiven of so much. And I've shared my testimony before, but before God saved me, I was smoking weed every day, doing ecstasy, cocaine, smoking methamphetamines, pretty much every drug under the sun besides like crack and heroin. I think those are the only, well, no, I did do heroin besides crack and mescaline. I didn't do mescaline ever. Anyway, so did a lot of drugs. And so when God finally saved me and I realized how powerful God was and how powerful his gospel was, that's what really drove me to want to tell others about him, about the God who saved me. And so when I was growing up in the faith and, got converted, I started watching a lot of videos on Facebook, and primarily videos of Jeff Rose preaching, Jeremiah Cry. And I also watched a little bit of Jeff Durbin stuff, talking to Mormons as well. And so just saw that there were people out there that had this boldness to preach Christ regardless of the response. And there's this classic video of Jeff preaching to this Catholic lady, and Jeff just telling the Catholic lady that Mary was a sinner and she didn't like that. But just seeing that there are people that were unashamed of the gospel and just had that boldness and just kind of going out seemingly without fear and just thundering out the gospel, it was something that always attracted me and something that I always wanted to take part in. And so I'd been a believer for 3 years when I finally met Jeff, and I've been a believer for 3.5 years whenever I started preaching with Jeff. And that day that it happened in Southlake, Jeff just put the mic on me, and my buddy Palmer, he got put up there too. He's a youth pastor now. He doesn't do as much open air but anymore. But anyway, Jeff just kind of put the mic on both of us. Palmer went first, and then I went second. And after I preached, I wasn't a part of Jeff's church at the time, but he just told me he wanted me to join his church. And so I started going to 116, left Countryside. And the Sunday after, people were like persecuting me for open air preaching. There's this guy who was just like totally like out of hand. And even when he sees me today, he yells at me and tells me to repent. And so I left Countryside because there was like persecution for evangelizing at Countryside, just bounced out of there. And anyway, went to 116, did a lot of ministry with Jeff, and I even got a pulpit ministry as well there and started preaching behind the pulpit. So yeah, he basically was like, it's like you've done this your entire life. That's one of the things he said to me. He's like, you couldn't tell that this was your first time like ever open air preaching. It just seems like you've always done this. Like you've never, like, it doesn't seem like you're new to this at all. It seems like you just know how to preach the gospel. So it was something that came like immediately and just started belting out all these scriptures that I had memorized and just proclaiming the gospel. And it just came naturally. I don't know. So yeah, that's what happened.
So when you did it versus how you thought it would happen, was there a difference, or was it exactly like you imagined it?
It's probably better than I imagined, to be honest. But I was really nervous at first, but then as soon as I turned on the amp and started speaking, like it was like my heart was beating faster than it had ever beated before in my whole life. It was just like coming like I thought, like it felt like I was gonna die. Like I was so nervous. But then whenever I started preaching, it's just like the spirit just took over, and like all those nerves and all that stuff just vanished away. So I think it was even better. It was just like I don't know. It's just, you understand, it's like this supernatural thing. You're almost like flying in a sense. You're just like flying and preaching Christ, and your eyes are focused on him. And it's just like the message that has saved you and made you alive. Just, it almost makes you more alive as you proclaim it. And it, Jeff always said it gives sort of a muscularity to your Christianity, is how he described it. And I think that's a very accurate way. I don't know if I could expound on that more, so don't ask me to do that. But that's something that he said. There's sort of a muscularity that it adds to your Christianity. And I never stopped after that. I probably haven't gone longer than 3 weeks. I don't think I've gone a month without open air preaching since I started. It's been like, I usually take like a week break or a 2-week break, or at most a 3-week break, but never longer. I think I only had like a 3-week break one time, but ever since I started, I haven't stopped, and it's been 6 years.
And so what were you afraid of before you started? What do you think you're afraid of, nervous about?
Just probably just people, honestly, which is stupid. Honestly, it's like I was just kind of scared. I mean, I don't know. I was nervous of the whole thing, just like public speaking in general.
Right.
So I usually get nervous before the pulpit. I don't get as nervous in the open air anymore. When you do it week in and week out constantly, the nervousness just kind of stops. People say you never stop being nervous preaching in the open air, but I disagree with that. For me, I'm not nervous when I open air. There's random times it'll just happen, and it'll be like very unexpected, I'll get nervous before. But there's also an element of fearing God in the whole process. I would say, like, especially more so in the pulpit. I mean, you fear God when I open air preach. Like, that's not what I mean, but like there's this element of just this fear of God before you're proclaiming the person of Christ because you want to represent God accurately. So there's a healthy fear in the nervousness, but there's also like a human element of like, oh, I'm going and talking to people. But the primary thing should be a fear of the Lord before we go, no matter where or how we're preaching, whether it's pulpit or street preaching, there needs to be a fear of God. And so I think that nervousness, whenever I do get it, sometimes God uses it and it almost helps with the preaching to a certain extent. There's just this great fear that comes upon me, and then it's almost the nervousness aspect of it is lifted, but then it's just like you're fearing God as you're proclaiming Christ, and there's just this powerful element where He takes a weak vessel, and the strength of God is displayed through that weak vessel.
Gotcha. So when you got through, you stepped down. What did you begin to imagine about preaching, that you would do it full time, that you wanted to go to certain crowds? How did you begin to think of how you could do it more, where, and so forth?
Well, Jeff had always told me about Scotland, and I think that first day he told me Scotland was a preacher's heaven, so it was always something that I was interested in, but I was so thrilled just to do it anywhere that I wasn't quite there yet. I wasn't like, oh, I can't wait to go to Scotland necessarily, but I was like, that would be fun, like to do that one day, which now I have done that last summer, went to Scotland for 10 days. So I did think about other places, but it was mostly just like, I'm just excited to preach Christ to anyone who will be in front of me. It doesn't matter if it's South Lake or Fort Worth or Scotland or Grapevine or just anywhere. And I did preach, and I would go back and forth between South Lake and Grapevine, but for a long time, South Lake was like where I started. That's where a lot of wealthy people are. In Texas, it's just like filthy rich people who think that they don't need Jesus, basically. And or some of them are Christians, or some of them go to Gateway. So it's like they say they're Christians, but they go to like really wonky, like prosperity gospel, word of faith churches. So there's a mixed element there, but you either, like I said, you either have people who are like, I don't need that, I'm wealthy, or you have the people who have like a, a borderline, if not heretical gospel. So it's an interesting crowd there, to say the least. And there's not always a whole lot of conversations, but sometimes kids will gather around and listen, like teenagers, and you'll get into good conversations with either like high school kids or college kids who are out there. And so it's a good spot for that sometimes.
So when did you decide to sort of quote be full time about it?
Because when you called me and you asked me if I was tired of cleaning pools or if I like cleaning pools still, and I said I was suffering, and you helped me out of it.
That's true.
You helped me out of a bind. Anyway, no, cleaning pools was good. They're good people, good Christian company I worked for, so I'm not bagging, but I just felt like there was more, like I was meant to do more with my life, and I wanted to be in full time ministry. And now, by God's grace, I am. I have been for a little over 3 years. So when I first started, I never really thought about going full time. I know that Jeff had done that, but I know that he struggled greatly. It didn't seem like something I would do. It didn't seem very practical. My now mother-in-law, when I was courting my wife and she was just my girlfriend, my mother-in-law like thought that I said I was going to do evangelism full time or something, and I was like, I never said that. But it was funny she said that, but she's like, you're not going to get money from being a street preacher. And that's, now it's like all I've been doing for, I've had this, well, I guess I haven't had it for any of my other, longer than any of my other jobs, but once I've been doing this for 4.5 years, if by God's grace I do it for 4.5 years, I haven't had a job longer than 4.5 years. Worked at Little Caesars about that long, and then did pools for a little over 3 years. So anyway, but I remember she was like saying, you can't get money street preaching. I'm like, I know I can't. Like, what are you talking about? But then just a few years after that, that's actually what I was doing full time. So it's kind of a funny, it's like she misheard me and said that, but then it actually became a reality. So yeah, hadn't thought of it until like I heard about the George Whitfield program, and I knew Joe Henson. I had met Joe Henson preach and saw him preach in the open air before I started. About 4 months before I started open air preaching is when I met Joe. At least that's when I remember meeting Joe. There's a funny video of me standing next to Joe while Jason Lyle was sharing the gospel with the Muslim on Denton Square, and this was like a year before I started open air preaching. And that was actually that's a really good story I don't tell as often that many people haven't heard. So I think it was this event that Heritage Grace had put together, and they had Jason Lyle on the Denton Square, and I was a manager at Little Caesars at the time. I got my schedule switched around to go to this event. Lived in Fort Worth with my parents, but drove up to Denton after work, after working a morning shift, to watch people street preach and to watch Jason Lyle engage with college students like on the mic. And there was like, he was just refuting. It was before I knew what presuppositional apologetics was, but Jason Lyle was using presuppositional apologetics and refuting a view that you're just like an illusion, because illusions are just false. Like, so if it's an illusion, then nothing's true. And so everything you're arguing is wrong and it's a lie and it's a deception. So that can't be true, because if it's a lie and it's a deception, it's not true. And so he's just like kind of going through, and like this guy's like, you got me in a hole. And he was like, yeah. And so like he was using I didn't even know what it was. I didn't even know what was going on in front of my eyes, but I saw that happening. And he's not even a street preacher. I don't think he's ever done it ever since then. But Lyle like engaging with these college students, defending the faith, and there's people behind him just screaming F-bombs at him, and he was just getting persecuted, and he just stood firm on the truth. You could tell he was nervous, but he just stood there and just took the persecution. And I remember leaving that day super convicted and being like, I'm not doing enough for the kingdom. I'm not doing enough for Christ. I work at Little Caesars. And so that had a huge impact on me, witnessing the different street preaching that day. All that to say, there's a video of me standing next to Joe Henson while Jason Lyle witnessed to a Muslim, but met Joe Henson. And a few years after preaching in the open air with him, heard about the Whitfield program. And you had messaged me, like, I didn't see the message in my inbox. We weren't friends on Facebook, but you were like trying to get a hold of me to talk to me about the Whitfield program and get to know me and stuff. And I finally was like available for a call. I feel like it was like a month or two after you had messaged me. Like I said, I didn't see it, and I was like, oh, this might be interesting to hear what he has to say. I knew who you were, heard about what you were doing and getting guys full time in the open air and in evangelism. And so we had that conversation, and I think it was only like 4 or 5 months after we talked on the phone that I just kind of took that step of faith, asked a few people if they would give to the ministry if I started doing full-time evangelism, and a bunch of people signed on, and it's been growing ever since. So yeah.
Being full-time, what describe that experience for people? How would you, not only the preaching, but your life and everything around you, how's it changed? Or
yeah, so people don't get what all is involved in full-time ministry, because a lot of the times I'll be preaching on the streets anywhere between 3 to 4 hours, sometimes 2 hours if I'm at like an IVF clinic preaching against the evils of child sacrifice and things like that. But there's more that goes into it. There's time of prayer, there's time of studying, I work on seminary before I go out and preach, so I'm slamming through working on school, and then I preach. And once I get home, I kind of need to focus on my family and just take care of things at home, and don't always get to go back into my office and work on school like I would like to. But have to take care of my wife and my kids. It's a blessing, but it's harder than what people would think it would be. You hear, oh, you're just gone 3 or 4 hours a day from the house, but I'm also in my study, in the office. There's times in which I'm getting equipped from seminary, being able to defend things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to defend if I wasn't in seminary. There's one example where I was at UTD, and there was a Catholic, and he's asking me questions about canonicity. And I was making the point that you can't take Enoch as a canonical book because it's pseudepigrapha. God is a God who cannot lie, and it's a book based on a lie. Pseudepigrapha is when someone says, my name is Enoch, I'm writing this, but Enoch didn't write it. And all the historical evidence is demonstrating that Enoch didn't write it. No one believes Enoch actually wrote Enoch. And so I was making an argument with a Catholic, and his mouth was just shut. He didn't know how to respond. And so there's this element of like studying things like the doctrine of scripture or textual criticism or apologetics. And these are things I study even apart from school. Now that, went to Bible college, was studying it even outside of school, and just continued to study the word and study these topics. But all that to say, you want to be as equipped as you possibly can be when you hit the streets. You want to know how to defend the faith. You want to know how to refute differing worldviews. You want to know what those worldviews are. You want to know what empiricism is, what naturalism is, what materialism is. You want to be able to engage with these different philosophies and be able to show, look, only Christ can make sense out of suffering. Only Christ can make sense out of morality. Only Christ can make sense out of laws of logic. He's the universal God who gives us these absolute objective standards, while you have a worldview that says everything's just relative. So all that to say, full-time ministry is not just the time on the streets, but it's also the time of preparation beforehand, the praying before and the praying after, and the fellowship afterwards, and taking care of your family afterwards as well. Like all of it's an all-encompassing thing, and it involves training other guys in the ministry and teaching them how to open air preach, and encouraging them, encouraging the saints, encouraging the people at your church. Hey, like you can't just pay me to evangelize. You have to evangelize too. It's a spiritual discipline. It's something that you're supposed to be doing as well. And so seeking to equip the saints when you can, and encouraging them to get out there to love and good works. So it's a multifaceted role and job. It's not just, okay, you just go preach by yourself and lurk over there. It's a lot more integral, and it's healthy for the church body to have that evangelist, especially a full-time evangelist. So that's what I would say. Hope that was helpful.
No, that's good. It's a consuming fire, no doubt about it. Now you wish you had 220, wish a day was 48 hours instead of 24. So cool. Tell us your best preaching story. Like you look at that and go, man, this was amazing. Like in other words, you get into it and you start seeing God work, but you have an exponentially amazing story. Tell us one of your amazing stories, surprising stories.
Oh man, that's a really hard one to answer. So much happens and it kind of flies in my brain and out my brain, to be honest. But I've seen God do some amazing things. I'd say one really amazing thing. I bring it up pretty often, but there was a guy named Leo that I had talked to. We were preaching at UNT. It was me, Joe Hinson, and Jacob Stafford. And maybe I could tell another story about Scotland after this, but there's this amazing thing that happened. Joe was just preaching pretty tamely. Honestly, it wasn't like anything crazy. He was very gentle and just merciful and talking about the mercies of God. And this guy got really angry about Joe telling him about the mercies of God. And this one crazy heckler just started spouting off at Joe and yelling and cussing and thinking he was wise in his own eyes and all this stuff. And it just built this crowd of like 40 or 50 people outside of UNT. And they were asking like, oh, do you study the original languages? I bet you couldn't read the Greek. And I like pulling out my Greek New Testament and being like, what, can you read this? And just like, well, I have a Greek New Testament in my hand. So that was interesting. But what had happened was there were these little pockets of conversations, and Joe just stayed on the mic for hours. And there was one point when I was standing next to him and I was backing him up, and we were both like defending the faith, and it was kind of an interesting task. But that was an interesting sort of dynamic that was welcomed, and he wasn't like offended. I wasn't stepping on any toes, but we were just kind of both answering questions as we were surrounded by like these 50 students. And this guy Leo was talking to me, and he grew up Catholic, and his whole thing was like he was defending homosexual sin. And I was just kind of explaining to him from Romans 1, and hey, it goes against nature, and it's a great form of idolatry, and God's the one who defines what is good and evil. And he didn't like receive it then, but then I shared the gospel with him and told him that it's all about grace through faith in what Christ has accomplished on the cross. Told him about the way of redemption and reconciliation. And I think I even quoted this verse to him, and this is kind of interesting. I couldn't tell you 100%, so I don't want to say this is definitely what happened. But I recall using Proverbs 14:12. It's quoted in other Proverbs, but there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And this guy, Leo, he had a friend who was a girl. They were just like good friends. I don't think they ever dated or anything, at least not when I had been talking to him. But she sort of ministered to him as well. And I prayed for him at the end of that conversation, but she was like, I think if God has all knowledge and he says this is wrong, I should probably listen to him. I think he probably knows better than I do. She said something like that to him about this issue of homosexuality, saying, I think God knows better than I do about these issues. And that just kind of hit him like a ton of bricks. And so his favorite verse became Proverbs 14:12. There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And that's his favorite verse. And he got converted, and he came up to us at UNT about almost a year after that conversation. And I said, "You look really familiar. Have we talked before?" Because I see thousands of students' faces at UNT. Just thousands of people are walking around, and we talk to countless people. I hand out tracts to, I've handed out tracts to thousands of students at UNT just over the years. So I see him, and I'm like, "You look really familiar." And he was like, "Yeah, we talked one day," and he reminded me of our conversation on that day when there was all those people, and he had said that he'd been a believer for 10 months. And I ended up inviting him into my office at my old house, and we had a sort of a testimony interview where I got to ask him questions, and it sort of led him and kind of spurred him on to explain how he got saved. And he had a worldview that was once defined by death. Like there was a way that seemed right to him, and its end was the way of death. He thought that homosexual sin was okay. He himself wasn't a homosexual, but he thought that his ways were righteous and God's weren't, and God couldn't speak to these realities. And then he got converted, and he's like, "There's a way that seems right to a man, is its end is the way of death." And it's like he had a worldview that was leading to death, and I got to talk to him about that. So it's an interesting audio interview with Leo. We had cameras, and Jacob said it wasn't very. I don't know. He said he just didn't want to use the video for whatever reason. But anyway, good audio, worth listening to. I think it's only like 15 or 20 minutes, but it's just a very powerful testimony about how God saved this student at UNT. And it started with that. And there's been other moments where we've been talking to people, and we're pressing in on the truth of the gospel message. And we just simply ask, like, "Okay, when are you going to get right with God?" And they say, "Right now." And so we've seen that happen quite a few times, and we've seen people come and just weep under the preaching of the gospel. So yeah, it's really incredible.
Cool. All right. So I know a clock's ticking for you. 2 questions are we done. One is talk about your studies. The studies you've engaged in, why do you pursue degrees, pursue the studies, and then talk about the Super Bowl. We'll be done.
Yeah, well, God uses men who don't go to seminary, and he uses men who do go to seminary. For me, it's structured, and it pushes me to write on things that I wouldn't otherwise write on or be tested on. There's really no test in seminary besides the one oral test at the very end, but there were tests in Bible college. But all these different things that I had to go through, whether in Bible college or in seminary, it's helping me know the character of Christ more. It's helping me to study Greek, getting into issues like textual criticism, and I'm more equipped to defend the faith than I would be if I hadn't gone to seminary. Like, I can get into issues of textual criticism that I wouldn't be able to get into, or even just any apologetics. I've studied a lot of apologetics on my own without school, but there were apologetics classes I took at the Masters University. Got to read Greg Bahnsen and write papers about ethics and things of that nature. Took philosophy courses as well that helped me in my defense of the faith. So it's really just being further equipped to defend Christ and just filling your mind with the things of God, I think. And if you have a set amount of things you need to do for school, you'll sit down and do it. It's a little bit harder when you don't have that. You don't have that structure, so it forces me to write on stuff I wouldn't write on. I just wouldn't do the things I'm doing, and then I grow from it and I learn from it. It's like when you're assigned to do a 15 minimum page paper on the Trinity or the law of God or hermeneutics or Ephesians 1, like any of those things. It's like, or Calvinism or postmillennialism, whatever it is, it's going to force me to grow in my faith. And so that's what I love about school. I love sitting and reading historical works of the Reformation, Calvin's Institutes, Francis Turretin's Institutes, systematic theologies, books on ethics, any of the things that are assigned. It's all very exciting to me. And if I'm going to study, and I'm going to study, I might as well get a degree. It's stupid if you're going to sit there and read theology books all day and you could have just signed up for some sort of program and you have something to show for it afterwards. Like, just get a degree, get a couple degrees, whatever, you know.
How does the writing help you in your understanding? What does it do to develop your understanding and communication?
Well, you're putting your thoughts to paper, and when you put your thoughts to paper, it helps you to communicate it later in other situations and other scenarios. And so, um, when you're actually writing on what you're learning, you also have a record of it as well. So it's like, even if you forget the things you've written, you can go back to it and be like, oh, wow, like there's this, like when you write down a sermon or you write a manuscript for a sermon, it's like you have this thing that helps you to teach others, and it also helps in your own growth and sanctification.
And one more question on that: studying original languages. How does it help you? How does it help you? How does it help another word better?
Well, one way it helps is it shows that the translations that we have do rightly reflect the revelation of God. There's not going to be a perfect translation, but we do see what God has said and revealed, and we can know that we have the revelation of God. We have the message of the gospel. We have the doctrines that God wants us to know. We know Jesus is God, for certain. Um, we know that it's by faith alone for certain. And another aspect of it is just understanding the way the words are functioning helps to pull out greater meanings behind the verses. Um, so there's different things that can be said regarding that. Great passages on assurance. Spurgeon, I was just saying this the other day, it's kind of coming to mind again. Spurgeon preached a message on Hebrews 13:5. He's preached two, actually. And the first one he preached was never, not never, not never, because that verse that says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you, it's more emphatic in the Greek. It says never like five times, basically. There's these five negatives. So it's like, I don't know how you would necessarily translate it. Hebrews is really hard to read in Greek. But what you see is that there's just this greater assurance that God's never going to leave us. And whenever there's these multiple negatives, it's emphatic. And so you see that in John 6:37 as well. And I pull these out a lot, but it's a double negative with an aorist subjunctive. So it's saying never, never, not even probable. So when it says all that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I'll never cast out. It's never, never, not even probable cast out. It's not even a probability that you'll be cast out by God. It can't even happen. It's not probable. Not even possible, not even probable. So that's one aspect of it. Is the subjunctives are really interesting to study. There's just different ways to understand text. Like we look at Colossians 2:14, the word for canceling the record of debt that stands against us. That word exalefo means to obliterate, to blot out, to erase. And so you get a greater picture of this concept of, okay, what does it mean to cancel the debt that stands against us? Well, it means it's erased. It means it's blotted out. And there's other ways in which something can function. For example, when Christ says, no, not Christ, excuse me, John the Baptist, when he says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, really, it could be translated, who is taking away the sin of the world. It's a continuous action, which helps prove postmillennial eschatology, because Christ is actually continually working through his sacrifice and through his reign as king to take away the sins of the earth. It's not something that happened and it's done and it's over with. It's a continuous action because it's a present active participle. So you see the same sort of grammatical thing happening in Titus 2, that the grace of God is training us by dousa. That word indicates that the grace of God will, as a continual action, as something that is ongoing, the grace of God will, in an ongoing way, teach you. It will discipline you. It will, what's another word for it? Teach, discipline. There's another word I can't think. Train you. It'll train you, teach you, discipline you to renounce ungodliness. So there's this can you if you're just reading it in English, it's just like grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness. But you don't look at training and say, and this word training means an ongoing action in the life of the believer. So this is why I tell people, I preach this in the open air, like if you say you've received the grace of God and you're walking in drunkenness, or you say you've received the grace of God and you're cohabitating with a partner outside of the covenant of marriage, well, the grace of God's not training you to renounce ungodliness. So how can you be sure that you've even received the grace of God at all? Because if you've received the grace of God it should be renouncing those things. It should be continually teaching you. You should have this ongoing process of sanctification that's telling you to deny that thing that you're living in. So these are things that you can pull out. You can pull these things out and say, look, this is this, and you got all kinds of stuff like that. Like there's perfect tense words. So whenever Christ says it is finished, it could be translated it has been finished, which means it's a completed action with continuing results. So the sacrifice of Christ is a completed action that happened nearly 2,000 years ago, but it's going to continue to have results. So that's going to result us now. It's going to he's bringing salvation to the ends of the earth now. In other words, that ransom that was paid when he said it is finished, it's going to continue to affect the world. It's completed action, but continues with results. So there's just different little things where you can spot a little gem. You're reading the Greek New Testament, you're translating it, it sounds like the same thing in English, and then you see like one thing and you're like, I never noticed that or knew that, or I didn't know that. One more gem and I'll leave it at this. In Mark 9, whenever Christ is prophesying his death and that he'll rise again on the third day, it's in the middle voice. And so when you see that it's in the middle voice, that's a for yourself action or a for yourself idea. So when he says the Son of Man will rise on the third day, it's actually saying the Son of Man will rise himself on the third day. And you can get that doctrine from reading John 2, like this temple, you see this temple, I'll build it, I'll rise it in 3 days. So you still have that doctrine, but if you're just reading your English Bible in Mark 9, you're not going to know, hey, this is in the middle voice, and God the Son was active in the resurrection. You're not going to know that if you don't know Greek. So you could preach that. You could say, Christ is the powerful God who rose himself from the dead from Mark 9. He prophesied he would do it, and he did it. He was active in the resurrection. The Spirit was active in the resurrection. The Father was active in the resurrection. Depending on which passage you look at, the resurrection is the work of the triune God, and so you can preach that, and you wouldn't be able to do that in an English Bible from Mark 9. You could do that from John 2 with your English Bible, but you wouldn't be able to if you don't know any Greek from Mark 9 or Mark 10. You wouldn't see it. It just says he will rise again on the third day. But it should be like he will rise himself on the third day. That's how, if I were to have my own translation, that's how I would translate that.
That's cool. Good answer. Okay, Super Bowl. We spent the weekend down in New Orleans. Talk about what you think will happen down there and invite people to come join you, be on the team.
Yeah, so it's going to be pretty intense. It's a very lawless city, and it needs the gospel. If you're going to go somewhere, I think New Orleans is a pretty good place to preach Christ. It's a place defined by drunkenness, defined by strip clubs and homosexuals walking around in thongs and all kinds of craziness. So it's a good place to bring the Christ who is the light of the world to bear and to really just believe in God's power to save sinners. And even if we don't see it happen, we know that his word doesn't return void. So I'm looking forward to it. I don't know if there will be a lot of conversations, but God's able to do that. He's able to bring people in, and his sheep hear his voice, and he's going to save all of his elect. He's going to save everyone he wants to save. So I'm looking forward to it. It'll probably be challenging and rough at some times in some areas. You can grow weary being out there laboring for hours and hours. But it's all worth it. Christ is worthy. You can't teach people to have the zeal that they need to evangelize, but if you have the zeal, if you have the knowledge of the gospel, and you love your neighbor and you love Christ, and you're going to come out to New Orleans and preach the gospel. That's what you're going to do.
That's good. Okay. All right. Well done. Thanks for joining me today. Good to see you. Good to hear your story.
Amen.
Take care of your family. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks a lot.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Bill. God bless you, brother. Bye.
Great. Will's a very talented young man, that's for sure. Very academically gifted. We've talked quite a bit over the last several years, so definitely someone to talk to about what he was talking about, studying Greek, the apologetics and so forth. He's definitely can give you a lot of wise counsel on how to do that, how to get it done, and how to be fruitful in it, and just how to have a lot of faith. When you get into this, like you said early on, his mother-in-law said that you're not going to be able to raise money to do this, and he's still at it 3 years later. So an immense amount of faith is required once you get into this work. So he would be an ideal person to talk further with about if you're looking to get out and preach Christ full time and keep going with studies and so forth. Hey, thanks for tuning in. Hope to check in with you next week.